What if I told you that the plants you've been pulling out of your garden your entire life could be worth more than an acre of corn? When Ethan Brooks lost everything and bought a forgotten farm in Missouri, his neighbors laughed as he refused to spray the weeds covering the land. But hidden among those wild plants was a forgotten business that had made the previous owner quietly wealthy for decades. As chefs, scientists, and major companies began arriving at his gate, everyone realized the biggest mistake wasn't buying the farm. It was ignoring what had been growing there all along. Cold spring rain drifted across the misty hills of the Ozark Highlands, Missouri. Fog wrapped around abandoned meadows where wild plants covered forgotten fields beneath a pale gray sky. Ethan Brooks pulled his old pickup truck to the edge of the property and shut off the engine, allowing the silence to settle around him. At 38, he carried the appearance of a man who had lived two different lives. He stood just under 6 feet tall with a solid, athletic frame softened slightly by years spent managing stores instead of working outdoors. His short, dark brown hair showed the first streaks of gray around the temples, and a neatly trimmed beard framed a square jaw that rarely betrayed emotion. His deep blue eyes reflected exhaustion more than age. Friends had always described Ethan as dependable, patient, and calm under pressure, qualities that had helped him climb from a grocery clerk to regional supermarket manager in St. Louis. But none of those qualities had protected him when the company collapsed under bankruptcy. One Friday afternoon, after nearly 15 years of loyal service, he walked out carrying nothing more than a cardboard box containing family photographs, a coffee mug, and his employee name badge. Since then, every job interview had ended with polite rejection, leaving him with shrinking savings and growing uncertainty. Returning to rural Missouri had never been part of his plan, yet it slowly became his only option. The neglected property had cost less than many used lawn mowers. Local residents considered it impossible to farm. Blackberry brambles formed thick walls along the fence lines. Patches of unfamiliar plants covered nearly every open space, and young oak saplings pushed through the remains of broken wooden fences. Even the real estate agent had laughed while completing the paperwork. "If you grow anything here," he had joked, "it'll be mosquitoes." Ethan smiled politely that day, but now, standing alone in the drizzle, he found himself wondering whether everyone else had been right. He spent the next several days clearing fallen branches and hauling away rusted scraps of metal left behind by previous owners. As he worked, he noticed something unusual. Although every neighbor called the plants weeds, they were remarkably diverse. Some carried tiny purple flowers, others released a pleasant citrus scent when crushed between his fingers, while several attracted clouds of bees despite the cool weather. Instead of spraying herbicide, Ethan began photographing each plant and recording its location inside a small notebook. Years in retail had taught him that value often depended on knowledge rather than appearance. Late one rainy afternoon, he entered the aging log cabin standing near the center of the property. Dust covered every surface, and the scent of damp cedar filled the air. Inside a warped kitchen cabinet, hidden behind cracked glass jars, he discovered an old rectangular tin box sealed beneath layers of newspaper. Expecting forgotten bills or family photographs, he carefully lifted the rusted lid. Inside lay dozens of neatly bundled receipts, handwritten letters, and invoices dating back more than 30 years. None mentioned corn, soybeans, or cattle. Instead, they listed shipments of dried leaves, wild flowers, medicinal herbs, and native plants sent to restaurants, botanical laboratories, herbal tea companies, and pharmaceutical researchers across several states. Ethan slowly unfolded one faded letter addressed to the former owner. A celebrated chef thanked him for delivering the finest wild herbs in the Midwest. Another invoice showed prices far higher than ordinary farm crops ever earned. Standing silently inside the weathered cabin, Ethan looked through the dusty window toward the fields covered with plants everyone called worthless. For the first time, he wondered if the previous owner had never failed to farm at all. Perhaps he had simply been growing something the rest of the town had never learned to see. The cold spring rain continued drifting across the Ozark Highlands. Thin morning mist clung to the hills, while countless wild plants glistened beneath soft gray clouds, untouched by the herbicides covering neighboring farms. Every sunrise found Ethan Brooks walking slowly across his small property with a notebook in one hand and his phone in the other. Instead of clearing the so-called weeds, he identified them one by one using botanical databases, university publications, and field guides. What began as simple curiosity quickly became an obsession. Many of the plants surrounding the cabin were not worthless weeds at all. They were native herbs, edible greens, medicinal flowers, and aromatic species whose names appeared repeatedly in research papers from supplement manufacturers, specialty tea companies, gourmet restaurants, and natural skincare producers. Each discovery challenged everything Ethan believed about farming. He realized the previous owner had not abandoned the land. He had simply understood something no one else did. One quiet afternoon, an elderly woman stopped beside the weathered fence carrying a woven basket filled with fresh bread. She introduced herself as Grace Holloway, an 83-year-old widow who had lived on the neighboring ridge since childhood. Grace stood barely 5'3", with a small, graceful frame that age had bent but never weakened. Her silver hair was gathered into a neat bun beneath a faded straw hat, and countless fine wrinkles surrounded her warm green eyes. Years of working outdoors had left her hands rough and sun-weathered, yet every movement remained gentle. After losing her husband to a farming accident more than 20 years earlier, Grace devoted herself to preserving the stories of the valley instead of letting them disappear with each passing generation. She spoke slowly, choosing every word carefully. When Ethan showed her the old invoices and letters, Grace smiled with quiet recognition. "I knew the man who owned this place," she said. Folks laughed at him every single season. She looked across the field where purple flowers, broad green leaves, and climbing vines stretched toward the edge of the woods. They said he was too lazy to grow corn. Grace softly laughed to herself. But every Thursday, before sunrise, a truck from St. Louis rolled into this driveway. They loaded sacks full of dried leaves, blossoms, roots, and herbs. By lunchtime the truck was gone, and nobody ever asked why. Ethan listened without interrupting. "Didn't anyone wonder who was buying them?" he finally asked. "They did," Grace replied. "But people only believe what they've seen before." The following weeks only made the mystery deeper. Ethan carefully separated every species growing across the property, labeling each section with numbered stakes. He dried small batches under controlled conditions, photographed every stage of growth, and contacted chefs, herbal tea producers, botanical researchers, and natural wellness companies across Missouri. Most never replied. A few requested photographs. Then, slowly, the answers began arriving. Several chefs recognized rare culinary herbs immediately. A specialty tea company asked whether he could provide larger quantities. One botanical supplier requested laboratory samples before discussing long-term contracts. Meanwhile, the people in town continued laughing whenever they drove past. Children joked that Ethan was raising weeds instead of crops. Even local farmers slowed their trucks just to shake their heads at the overgrown field. Ethan never argued. Every evening he returned to the cabin, added another page to his growing notebook, and quietly reminded himself that truth did not become less valuable simply because few people recognized it. As another cold rain tapped gently against the old cabin roof, Ethan looked across the thriving patchwork of wild plants and realized he was no longer searching for hidden treasure. He was learning an entirely new way to see the land. Summer arrived with warm rains sweeping across the Ozark Highlands almost every afternoon. Moist air settled over the hills, and the once-forgotten field glowed with healthy native plants that seemed to flourish more beautifully after every storm. Ethan Brooks no longer spent his mornings wondering whether the land held value. Now he spent them answering emails. The small notebook that had once contained nothing but plant names had grown into a carefully organized record of harvest dates, drying temperatures, moisture levels, photographs, and laboratory references. Every bundle of leaves or flowers leaving the property carried a label showing exactly where it had been harvested, how it had been processed, and when it had been dried. Ethan refused to describe any plant as a miracle cure. Instead, every package contained a simple statement, harvested according to documented botanical standards. He believed trust could only be earned through honesty. One Friday afternoon, a black delivery van stopped beside the old cabin. The visitor introduced himself as Chef Daniel Ross, a 46-year-old executive chef from one of Kansas City's most respected farm-to-table restaurants. Daniel stood nearly 6 feet 2, with a broad athletic build developed during decades inside demanding professional kitchens. His dark hair was lightly touched with gray above his ears, while a neatly trimmed beard framed a confident but approachable face. His sharp brown eyes noticed tiny details that most people ignored, a habit formed after years judging the freshness of ingredients within seconds. Calm under pressure and endlessly curious, Daniel believed the finest meals always began with exceptional ingredients rather than expensive techniques. He had ordered several small samples after seeing photographs Ethan posted online. Standing beside a wooden work table covered with carefully dried herbs and flowers, Daniel examined each bundle without speaking. He rubbed several leaves gently between his fingers before lifting them to his nose. A slow smile crossed his face. "I haven't smelled quality like this in years," he said quietly. Later that evening, Daniel prepared several dishes using Ethan's native herbs and edible wild greens for his restaurant's tasting menu. Within days, he called again. "I'll take everything you can grow." That single order opened a door Ethan had never expected. Soon, specialty tea companies requested aromatic leaves. Small natural skincare businesses asked for carefully dried flowers. Boutique herbal suppliers wanted samples for quality testing. Ethan accepted only the orders he could fulfill without lowering his standards. Growing too quickly, he believed, often destroyed the very quality customers were seeking. As demand increased, another visitor arrived. Dr. Sophia Turner, a 42-year-old botanist from the University of Missouri, stepped onto the property carrying a weatherproof field case and several plant identification guides. Sophia was 5 feet 7 with a lean build shaped by years of hiking through forests and wetlands collecting native species. Her shoulder-length auburn hair was tied into a practical ponytail beneath a faded field hat, and her intelligent gray eyes constantly scanned the surrounding vegetation. Her lightly freckled skin and worn hiking boots reflected years spent outdoors rather than inside laboratories. During the early years of her career, she had watched countless native plant populations disappear beneath commercial development, leaving her deeply committed to documenting and protecting overlooked species before they vanished forever. Sophia spent 3 days surveying Ethan's property. She identified several native species currently being studied for valuable natural compounds by universities and research laboratories across North America. Yet she made one point perfectly clear. "These plants deserve careful scientific research," she explained. "They are not magic, and they should never replace proper medical care." Ethan immediately agreed. That philosophy became the foundation of every partnership he accepted. As autumn approached, the small field once dismissed as useless was earning more income than many surrounding farms several times its size. Yet Ethan never believed the success belonged to him alone. It belonged to knowledge, patience, and the willingness to see value where others saw only weeds. Autumn rain swept gently across the Ozark Highlands, washing the hills in silver mist while cool winds carried the scent of wet leaves through the valleys. Ethan's once-forgotten field had become greener than ever, quietly drawing attention from far beyond Missouri. News about Ethan Brooks spread quickly after several newspapers and agricultural magazines featured his unusual farm. Television crews arrived to film the native plants growing where most people had expected only weeds. Visitors drove for hours just to walk through the small property, amazed that less than an acre of land could supply restaurants, herbal tea companies, skincare manufacturers, and botanical researchers at the same time. Ethan welcomed anyone willing to learn, but he politely refused interviews that promised sensational headlines. Every conversation ended with the same sentence: "This isn't a miracle. It's careful observation supported by science." One crisp October morning, a black luxury SUV rolled slowly into the gravel driveway. The driver introduced himself as Victor Hale, a 53-year-old executive representing Green Core Botanicals, one of the country's fastest-growing botanical ingredient companies. Victor stood over 6 feet tall with a broad, confident posture, neatly combed salt and pepper hair, and a clean-shaven face marked by years of boardroom negotiations. His dark gray eyes rarely revealed emotion, and his tailored charcoal suit looked strangely out of place beside Ethan's muddy fields. Calm, articulate, and highly persuasive, Victor had spent 3 decades purchasing valuable agricultural properties for corporate development. He genuinely admired innovation, but he also believed important discoveries should be owned, protected, and commercialized before competitors could reach them. Inside the cabin, Victor placed a leather folder across the kitchen table. "We're prepared to purchase everything," he said. "The land, the plant collections, the research records, even your future consulting services." The number written on the final page exceeded anything Ethan had imagined earning in his lifetime. For a brief moment, Ethan stared silently at the offer. He thought about the years of uncertainty after losing his career, the sleepless nights wondering whether he had made a terrible mistake, and the financial security this contract could provide. Then he slowly closed the folder. "If this knowledge belongs anywhere," Ethan said quietly, "it belongs to everyone willing to care for the land." Victor accepted the rejection with professional courtesy, shook Ethan's hand, and drove away. Less than 2 weeks later, just after midnight, motion lights flashed outside the cabin. Ethan rushed outdoors with a flashlight, but whoever had entered the property disappeared into the darkness before he arrived. Several rare native plants had been dug from the demonstration garden, and a handful of carefully labeled research specimens were missing. Tire tracks disappeared onto the county road before sunrise. Rather than giving in to anger, Ethan immediately called Dr. Sophia Turner. By the following afternoon, they confirmed that every DNA record, high-resolution photograph, distribution map, cultivation journal, laboratory reference, and field observation had already been securely stored across multiple encrypted cloud servers maintained by the university and backed up independently by Ethan himself. Nothing essential had been lost. Standing beside the damaged garden, Ethan reached a decision that surprised even Sophia. Instead of protecting the knowledge behind locked doors, he published complete cultivation guides, sustainable harvesting methods, and botanical identification manuals online free of charge. He organized weekend workshops for local farmers and invited anyone interested to learn how native plants could be grown responsibly without damaging natural ecosystems. Some people questioned his decision. "If everyone knows the secret," one farmer asked, "won't you lose your advantage?" Ethan smiled as gentle rain began falling once again. "Knowledge isn't like land," he replied. "The more people share it, the more valuable it becomes." As the first group of neighboring farmers gathered beneath the old barn roof to study the newly printed guides, Ethan realized he was no longer building a successful farm. He was helping build a community that could grow together. 2 years later, gentle spring rain once again drifted across the rolling hills of the Ozark Highlands. Fresh mist floated above thriving fields where native plants flourished across the valleys that had once been dismissed as nothing more than patches of useless weeds. The little property Ethan Brooks had purchased with almost nothing had become the Ozark Native Plant Cooperative, a place where farmers, university students, botanists, chefs, and small business owners gathered throughout the year to learn how native plants could provide both economic opportunity and ecological restoration. What had begun as one man's quiet experiment now stretched across hundreds of acres managed by families throughout southern Missouri. Instead of competing against one another, neighboring farmers shared seeds, cultivation records, drying techniques, and market information. Their success no longer depended entirely on corn or soybeans. Carefully managed native herbs, edible wild greens, aromatic flowers, and specialty botanical crops had become valuable new sources of income while helping restore pollinators and healthier soils to the region. Ethan still lived in the same modest cabin overlooking the original field. Success had changed his circumstances, but it had never changed his character. His beard carried a few more gray hairs than before, and countless mornings spent working outdoors had deepened the lines around his eyes. Yet visitors still found him walking the fields with a notebook instead of giving speeches from an office. Whenever reporters asked how he had become successful, he always answered with the same quiet smile. "I didn't discover treasure," he would say. "I simply stopped ignoring what had always been here." Dr. Sophia Turner continued working alongside the cooperative, helping establish research partnerships with universities while ensuring every recommendation remained supported by scientific evidence. Grace Holloway often sat beneath the old oak tree near the entrance, smiling as young families filled baskets with native seedlings instead of herbicide. Even Chef Daniel Ross returned each spring to introduce local cooks to ingredients that had once been thrown away as weeds. Perhaps the greatest surprise came one cool April morning when farmers from neighboring counties arrived asking not for Ethan's products, but for his advice. They wanted to learn how to identify native species, restore neglected land, and create sustainable businesses that respected both nature and future generations. Ethan welcomed every one of them. He remembered too clearly what it felt like to stand alone while everyone else laughed. Near the entrance stood a handcrafted wooden sign carved from local oak. Rain had darkened the grain, but the words remained clear for every visitor who entered. Nature rarely creates weeds. People simply fail to recognize their value. Each time Ethan paused before that sign, he found himself thinking less about the plants and more about people. How many opportunities had been dismissed because they looked ordinary? How many lives had been overlooked because others failed to see their worth? As the afternoon sunlight broke through the passing clouds, the hills shimmered with countless shades of green stretching toward the horizon. Ethan realized that the greatest gift hidden within the old field had never been a profitable plant or a successful business. It was a new way of seeing the world, one built on curiosity instead of assumption, patience instead of haste, and humility instead of pride. That was the harvest he hoped would continue growing long after he was gone. Sometimes God's greatest miracles don't appear as lightning from the sky. Sometimes they grow quietly in places the world has overlooked. Just as Ethan discovered hidden value in what others called weeds, God often places his greatest blessings where few people think to look. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs a little hope today. Leave a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. And if you enjoy inspiring stories of faith, perseverance, and second chances, don't forget to subscribe and join our community. May God bless you, protect your family, and fill your life with hope, wisdom, and peace. Amen.